The marriage articles were bound in black ribbon, and they had been read aloud to Aloan twice before she was ever permitted to touch the pen. They lay spread across the long oak table in the muniment room of Windhollow, page upon page in a clerk's careful hand, and most of what they held was the ordinary machinery of a bargain struck between a poor duke and a rich man's ward. A sum paid on the wedding morning. The estate's debts answered from it. A household kept, a motherless child provided for. A title worn like a coat cut for a larger man. Dull, sensible lines, the kind men of business ruled onto paper every day without feeling their weight. But the final article stood alone. It sat beneath a hard black line, set apart from all the rest, as though the man who had dictated it could not bear to let it share a page with anything gentler than itself. The Duke shall grant his wife his name, his roof, and the protection of his house for the whole of her natural life. He shall grant her nothing beyond these. There shall be no courtship between them, no tenderness, and no claim upon the heart, now or ever. This is the whole of what is offered, and the whole of what may ever be asked. Aloan read it through once. She did not read it a second time. She had learned long ago that a thing meant to wound you loses some of its power the moment you refuse to flinch, and so she kept her face smooth as the snow beyond the windows and waited. Around her the witnesses shifted in the cold, a lawyer with pale fingers, a curate who would not meet her eyes, and the steward, Mr. Brames, Rennick, a soft-spoken man with a neat gray beard and a smile that never reached the flat attention of his gaze. He watched her the way a cat watches a door. It has not yet decided whether to guard. At the head of the table stood the Duke of Halvane himself. Will, Emmerich was younger than she had expected, and colder, tall, dark-haired, with a face that seemed carved rather than born, and a stillness about him that was not calm, but the hard economy of a man who has decided that feeling anything at all is a luxury he can no longer afford. He had not looked at her once through the entire reading. When at last he did, it was worse than being overlooked. "You understand the last clause," he said. It was not a question. "I understand all of them, Your Grace. Most women in your position would ask me to soften it. I have not asked you to soften anything." Something crossed his eyes. Surprise, perhaps. Swiftly shuddered. He inclined his head a fraction, as if she had passed a test he had not troubled to warn her of. Then, "Sign," he said, "and we need never speak of feeling again." She took the pen. The nib scratched her new name into the vellum, and Rennick leaned in at once to blot it dry, as though he feared the ink might change its mind. It was done. She was the Duchess of Halvane. She had been in the house 4 hours. The Duke did not offer his hand. He bowed to her as he might have bowed to a stranger met on a public road, and walked out, and the door closed behind him with the soft, final sound of a lid settling onto a box. Only then did Elowen let herself breathe. She looked down at the black-ribboned articles, at that last cruel line waiting under its black rule, and she felt something rise in her that was not grief and not fear, but something with a spine to it. No claim upon the heart now or ever. He believed he had built a wall. He did not know he had handed her a door. Because Aloan had not come to Windhollow to be loved, she had come for the locked room at the top of the north stair, and for the lie sewn into the debt that was slowly swallowing this house, and for a name, not the fine new one drying on the vellum, but an older one, a stolen one, that she had crossed 3 counties and buried under a wedding to reclaim. He had promised never to love her. Let him keep the promise. It would be far easier to strike the chains from a man who never once suspected she had come to unlock them. The staff of Windhollow feared many things. The moor in winter, the master's silences, the drop in the housekeeping money that everyone pretended not to notice, but the thing they feared without ever saying so was the child. Aloan heard the whispers within her first week, the way one hears weather through a shut door. The young lord was not right, the scullery maids murmured. He had not spoken a single word in the 14 months since the old duchess died. He walked the corridors at odd hours with his pale, watchful face and his mother's gray eyes, and he would stand in a doorway looking at you until you found some reason to be elsewhere. A boy of 6 who never wept and never laughed and never asked for anything was not natural. They agreed, crossing themselves over the washtubs. It was as though the grief of the whole house had climbed into one small body and taken up residence there. His name was Cassian, and Eloan was told, on no fewer than 4 separate occasions, that the new Duchess would not be expected to trouble herself with him. He had a nurse. He had tutors. He ignored. He was, in the careful phrasing of the housekeeper, Mrs. Alcott, his Grace's concern and his Grace's alone. Eloan did not seek the boy out. That was not her purpose, and her purpose left no room for the taking on of griefs that were not her own. She kept to her rooms and to the corridors she needed, mapping the house in her mind, like a woman learning the tide tables of a dangerous coast where the servants gathered, when the master rode out, which doors stayed locked and which keys hung where. And yet the boy found her. The first time was in the long, cold gallery where the dead Dukes of Halvain hung in their frames and pretended not to watch her pass. She had gone there alone, ostensibly to study the portraits, in truth to test a door at its far end. And she turned from the lock to find him standing in the archway. He was very small against the height of the hall. He held something cupped in both hands, close to his chest, the way a child guards a bird he has found and does not yet know is dead. She did not smile at him. She had noticed already that smiles made him retreat, and she did not speak. She simply went on, with what looked like idle looking, and let him be there if he wished to be there. After a long moment he crossed the floor to her, not shyly, deliberately, as though he had weighed her against some private measure, and found her worth the risk. He stopped an arm's length away and opened his hands, and in them lay a small bird, carved from pale wood, its wings folded, its 2 eyes marked in ink. One wing had broken off at the shoulder and been fitted back so many times that the join had gone dark and soft with handling. Eloan looked at the little broken thing, and then at the boy, and understood without being told that his mother's hands had made it. "He is well made," she said quietly, as she might have said it to a grown man. "Whoever mended his wing loved him very much." Cassian looked up at her, and for the space of one breath, in the great gray silence of that gallery, something passed between them that had nothing to do with the household, or the contract, or the reasons she had come. Then he closed his hands over the bird again, and without a word, slipped one of them into hers. His fingers were cold. He did not hold on tightly. He simply left his hand inside hers, as if returning something she had not known she was missing, and he leaned the smallest weight of himself against her arm, and he breathed. Eloan stood very still. She had armored herself against a great many things before entering this house. She had not thought to armor herself against this. She was so occupied with the boy that she did not, at first, feel the second presence at all. The change in the air, the sense of the room having gained a door it did not have before. When she finally lifted her eyes, the Duke of Halvain was standing at the far end of the gallery, one hand still resting on the frame of the entry, utterly motionless. He was staring at his son's small hand folded into hers, as though he were looking at something impossible, as though the boy had done, in the space of a moment, a thing that Emmerich himself had been failing to do for 14 months. He did not speak, he did not come forward, but his face, for one unguarded instant before the shutter came down over it, was not cold at all, it was stricken. Her name was not Eloan, of anywhere. Her name, the one that mattered, the one she had folded away and sewn into the lining of a new life, was Eloan Carroll, and she had come to Wind Hollow not for a title, and not for the fortune the world believed she'd brought, but for the truth of what had been done to her father. Elias Carow had been a country solicitor, a mild, exact man who kept other people's most dangerous secrets in a locked cabinet and slept soundly because he never once betrayed them. He had raised Eloan alone after her mother died, and taught her to read a document the way other fathers taught their sons to read the sky. "Learn its stones," he used to say, and no rich man's storm can carry your roof away. He had believed it until the day it stopped being true. The ruin came quietly, in forged instruments, deeds and bonds, bearing signatures that were not the signatures they claimed to be, drawn in a hand so fine that 3 courts refused to see the difference. Debts he had never contracted appeared under his seal. Monies he had held in trust were shown on paper to have vanished into his own pockets. He was struck from the rolls, his good name turned overnight into a thing men wiped from their boots, and he did not survive the second winter of it. Elowen, 19 and penniless, buried him in a churchyard that would barely take him, and promised the frozen ground that she would learn the name of the hand that forged those papers if it took her the rest of her life. It had taken her 4 years, and the name, when at last she ran it to ground, was Ambrose Rennick, the same Rennick who now kept the ledgers of Halvain. The same soft-bearded, flat-eyed man who had blotted her wedding signature dry with such tender care, for that was the shape of the thing Elowen had uncovered, thread by patient thread, across those 4 cold years. The trick that had murdered her father was being worked again, larger and slower, upon the Duke of Halvain. The great debt said to be strangling the estate. The debt her own marriage settlement was arranged to feed was not honest. It rested on a bond Emeric's late father was supposed to have signed and had not. Rennick had forged a dead man's promise into a living man's chains, drawing them tighter by the season, so that when at last the house could not pay, it would fall quietly and lawfully into the steward's hands. And Rennick had arranged this marriage himself. That was the bitter marrow of it. He did not know who she was. To Ambrose Rennick, she was only the well-dowered ward of a distant, gullible benefactor, a convenient purse to be married into Halvain and quietly emptied. He had reached out to bring in fresh money, and, without suspecting it, he had brought the solicitor's daughter into his own house, into the one place on earth where the proof of both his crimes was most likely hidden. For the proof did exist. It had to. A forgery, clever enough to fool 3 courts, is never trusted by the forger himself. A man like Rennick would keep the true paper somewhere. He could burn it in an instant if the ground ever shifted. Her father's old clerk, dying, had told her as much. Such men keep their poison close, and in a house like Windhollow, close had a name and a door, the locked room at the top of the north stair, the late Duke's muniment room, where the deeds and dead men's secrets of Halvain lay behind an iron lock to which only 2 keys existed in all the world. One hung on the ring at Ambrose Rennick's belt, the other never left the person of the Duke of Halvain. So that was the whole of her purpose, to find the true bond, prove the debt a lie, and strike the chains from a man who had married her precisely because she promised to want nothing from him. A clean plan, a just one. It asked her only to keep her heart out of it entirely. She had not counted on the boy. She had not counted on the way a small, cold hand could slip into hers in a gray gallery and undo a knot she had spent 4 years learning to tie. And she had not, she told herself firmly. Alone in her rooms, with the moor wind worrying at the glass, she had not counted on the look she had surprised on the Duke's face, that single stricken instant before the shutter fell, which had not looked like the face of a man who could feel nothing at all. None of it could be allowed to matter, because a clock was ticking under all of it, and Elowen alone could hear it. The false debt fell due at midwinter, 10 weeks away, and on the day it fell, Rennick would move to take the house, and every scrap of proof in that locked room would be the first thing he burned. 10 weeks to free a man who had forbidden her to try. Elowen learned quickly that the Duke of Halvain ruled the moor, the tenants, and the name, but that Ambrose Rennick ruled the money, and in a house 10 weeks from ruin, the man who ruled the money ruled very nearly everything else besides. He came to her on the 3rd morning in the small east parlor, bearing a tray of documents and a smile of such gentle solicitude that a woman with less to hide might have been grateful for it. "Your Grace must not trouble her head with any of this," he said. laying the papers before her the way one lays a treat before a dog one intends to train. The settlement, the allowances, the household books, dull, tangled business, all of it. His late Grace trusted these matters entirely to me, as does his present Grace. You need only sign where I have marked, and think no more about it. A young lady's mind was never meant for ledgers. Eloan folded her hands and let her face go pleasant and empty. How kind, she said. I confess, figures make my eyes swim. It was the answer he wanted, and she watched him accept it, and she signed where he pointed with a hand that did not once betray how well those swimming eyes could read a forged column. She noted, too, that among the papers he slid before her was a fair copy of a letter, her letter. The one she had written 2 days before to her father's old friend in the South, recopied in a clerk's hand for safekeeping. He was reading her correspondence. Of course he was. There is one further matter, Rennick went on, gathering the pages. The young lord. A house of mourning is no soil for a delicate child to grow in. Arrangements are being made quietly, after the new year, to send him to his late mother's people in the South. Kinder for everyone, I think. Your Grace agrees. The blow landed somewhere beneath Eloan's ribs, and she did not let it show. So, that was the shape of it. Remove the heir, remove the last person in the house whose affection could not be bought or book-kept, and the road to Halvane's quiet swallowing ran smoother still. I am sure His Grace knows best, she said. His Grace, said Rennick, rising, has come to leave a great many things to me. He paused at the door. And when he spoke again, his voice had not changed at all, which was what made it terrible. You will forgive an old servant's care, Your Grace, but the north stair is not safe. The stone is loose above the second landing. We keep it locked, for your own protection. A beat. I should hate for you to come to harm, so newly arrived among us. He bowed and was gone, and Eloan sat very still in the empty parlor, understanding two things with perfect clarity. He had already noticed where her eyes went in this house. And a man who had forged one family into the grave would not lose a night's sleep, arranging an accident on a stair. If Rennick was the house's cold engine, the Duke was its cold heart, and Eloan came to know him the way one comes to know a shut door, by the draught under it, and by never once seeing it open. They dined together each evening because the forms required it, at a table so long that a footman had to carry her, single remark the length of it to reach him, by which time it had cooled to nothing. He wore black. He was unfailingly, exhaustingly, courteous. He asked after her comfort, and did not listen to the answer. He never spoke of his son, and he never ever spoke the name Isolde. She had learned it only from the servants, in the same breath as the sealed door of the west chamber that had not been opened since the lady died within it 14 months before. Once, and only once, Eloan made the mistake of reaching for the man behind the manners. The child seems very alone, she said gently, down that endless table. If it would not displease you, I might. You need not trouble yourself with my son, madam. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You need not trouble yourself with me. That was the whole of our bargain, and I find bargains are the only promises worth keeping, the only ones that do not come due later. In grief, he returned his gaze to his plate. Eat. The more cold gets into anyone who does not. She understood him better after that. He had not built his wall out of cruelty. He had built it out of arithmetic. He had loved once, and the loving had cost him everything a man could be made to pay, and he had done the sum, and resolved never to be so ruined again. A man like that does not want a wife. He wants a witness who will not ask him to feel. It was so as she rose from that silent dinner that she saw it. He leaned toward the branch of candles to snuff them, and his collar fell open at the throat, and there, on a fine dark chain against his skin, hung an old iron key, worn smooth, black with age. She knew that key. She had spent 4 years imagining it. It was the key to the north stair room, and he wore it against his heart, against the one thing in all the world he had sworn she would never be permitted to touch. Lowen went up to her rooms that night and stood a long while at the black window, and did the sum herself to reach the key. She would have to reach the man. To reach the man, she would have to breach the very wall the contract had built to keep her out. His and hers both. 10 weeks, 1 key, and 2 people who had each, in writing and in blood, forsworn the only road that led to it. The Duke of Halvain could not stop seeing the gallery. 14 months. For 14 months, his son had not let a living soul lay a hand on him. Not the nurse who had raised him, not the great-grandmother he had once adored, not Emeric himself, who had reached for the boy across that gulf so many times and drawn back so many times that he had finally stopped reaching. And then a stranger. A bought wife, 4 days in the house, a woman he had married expressly so that he would never have to feel anything toward her at all. And Cassian had crossed a cold gallery and put his hand into hers, as simply as breathing. Emeric had gone into that marriage, with his eyes open and his heart shut. He knew what a dukedom was worth on the marriage market. He had braced himself for the particular campaign such a wife would wage. The small charms, the studied kindnesses, the slow, patient work of making herself necessary, of turning his son or his servants or his own buried loneliness into a lever against the clause he had set in the contract. He had watched other men fall to it. He had promised himself he would not. He need not have troubled, because his wife waged no campaign at all. She kept the contract more faithfully than he did. She asked him for nothing, not money, not attention, not the smallest softening of a single line. When they met, she was courteous and closed and gone again, and Emeric, to his considerable irritation, found that he had begun to watch the door for her without deciding to, and he began to notice things. He noticed that she was kind to the boy the way one is kind to a person, not a pet, that she did not coo over Cassian or crowd him, but simply let him be near, and that the child who fled from tenderness had started to trail her from room to room like a small determined shadow. He noticed that when Rennick unrolled the estate figures and explained them to her slowly, as to a child, something flickered behind her pleasant, empty expression, a quickness, a comprehension there, and gone in an instant, that did not belong to any merchant's gullible ward. A woman who read a column of figures the way his own lawyers read them, and took great care that no one should see her do it. He filed the small wrongness away, and did not know yet what to make of it. Then Rennick came to him. "I would not presume, Your Grace," the steward began, which was how he always began before presuming a great deal. "But the household has remarked upon it, and I should be failing you if I did not. The new Duchess wanders. She asks the servants questions about the family, about your late father's affairs, about the North Wing. She takes an interest that is, forgive me, irregular in a wife of her station and origin. It might be wise to keep her grace to the family rooms. We know so little of where she truly comes from. A month before, Emeric would have nodded and left it in the steward's capable hands, as he left everything. He was tired, and Rennick was competent, and it was easier. He did not nod now. For the picture Rennick painted, a grasping, prying, scheming woman, refused to sit over the woman he had watched, turn away from his son's inheritance of grief, and ask for nothing in return. The two would not lie flat together. And underneath his irritation, something older stirred, something he had buried so deep he had half forgotten it was there. Isolde had asked questions too. In the last weeks before she died, his wife had come to him more than once, troubled with papers in her hand and the steward's name in her mouth, wanting him to look, to listen, to see, and he, drowning in the estate and his own distraction, had told her to leave the business to Rennick and not to tire herself. "The numbers do not answer, Emeric," she had said one evening, her finger pressed to a column, her face pale in a way he had blamed on the coming child. "I have asked Mr. Bay Rennick a dozen times to let me into your father's room, and each time the key is lost, or the hour is wrong, or he smiles and turns me towards something gentler. Does that not strike you as strange?" He had kissed her forehead, and told her the grief made shadows out of honest dust, and that she must rest. It was the last serious thing she ever tried to tell him. 3 weeks later the fever took her, and the child that came too soon went into the same grave, and there had been no room left in him for anything but the losing of her. Then she was gone, and he had folded the memory away with everything else too painful to hold now. Standing before a steward warning him against a curious wife, a thin, cold draught found the buried thing and stirred it. He dismissed it, almost. "Leave it with me," was all he said, and Rennick bowed and withdrew, and Emmerich told himself he had heard nothing worth hearing. That afternoon, moved by an impulse he did not examine, he went to find his son. He found him in the old nursery, in the gray window light, and he stopped in the doorway, because his wife was there, and neither of them had seen him. She was not teaching the boy, nor petting him. She sat with the little carved bird in her lap, mending its broken wing with a strip of linen and a thread of glue, her dark head bent to the work, and Cassian sat pressed against her side, watching her hands with the whole of his solemn attention. And as Emmerich watched, unseen, his son opened his mouth. "Wing," said Cassian. One word, small, cracked, rusty, from 14 months of silence, but a word, his first, spoken to a woman who had been in the house not yet a fortnight. Emmerich felt it go through him like a blade drawn slowly out of a wound he had thought long closed. His eyes stung. His hand found the doorframe. Isolde had always said the boy saw what was true, long before the rest of them did. He withdrew before either of them marked him, and stood in the cold corridor with his heart hammering against the iron key at his throat, and he understood that something in the frozen architecture of him had shifted and would not shift back. He should have known Rennick would be waiting. "I've made the first arrangements for the young lord's removal," the steward said smoothly, falling into step beside him. "After the New Year, as we discussed, and I confess, your grace, the Duchess's influence over the child grows irregular. It would be kinder to all to loosen it now." Emmerich stopped walking. "The boy stays," he said. Rennick blinked. "Your grace, he stays at Wind Hollow, and the Duchess will go to him whenever she wishes, without let or question from you, or anyone in your charge. Is that understood, Mr. Rennick?" For the space of a breath, something showed in the steward's flat gray eyes, not anger, which Emmerich would have understood, but something colder and more patient, the look of a man watching a small, unexpected obstacle appear across a road he had been traveling a very long time. Then it was gone, folded back behind the deference. "Perfectly, your grace," said Rennick. Emmerich dismissed it as a servant's wounded pride, and went on. But that night, for the first time since he had buried his wife, the Duke of Halvain did not sleep. He lay in the dark and lifted the iron key from its chain, and turned it over and over in his fingers, the key to the sealed room, to his father's papers, to all the buried business of Halvain. And he thought of gray eyes and a mended wing, and a wife who asked for nothing and read ledgers like a lawyer, and he did not know what he suspected, only that he had begun at last to suspect. And 2 floors below, in the steward's room, a lamp burned very late. Ambrose Rennick sat at his desk with a clean sheet of paper before him, and dipped his pen, and began, quietly, patiently, in that same fine and faultless hand, to make certain inquiries of his own into exactly who the new Duchess of Halvain had been before she came. The Dowager Duchess came to Wind Hollow the week after the first hard snow, unannounced the way weather comes. The house felt her arrival before it saw her, a carriage in the drive at an hour no visitor kept, then a stick striking the flagstones with the unhurried authority of a woman who had never in her life waited to be admitted anywhere. She was very old and very upright, Emmerich's grandmother, with a face folded soft as a glove and black eyes that had lost none of their edge to the years. She had governed Helvane in her own day and never entirely surrendered the habit of it. The servants straightened when she passed. Mrs. Alcott's harried face eased into something like relief, and Ambrose Rennick's smooth deference acquired in her presence a faint and interesting strain, as of a well-oiled hinge asked to bear more weight than it liked. She had come, she announced, to see her great-grandson through the worst of the winter. She said nothing of the debt, or the marriage, or the mute child, but Eloan understood within an hour of her arrival that the dowager had come precisely because of all three, and meant to take the measure of the stranger her grandson had bought. She met the boy first. Eloan, passing the morning-room door, saw the old woman lower herself with difficulty to Cassian's height and study him without a scrap of pity, and heard her say, "You have your mother's eyes, and they were the best thing in this house. Do not let anyone tell you it is a sadness to look like the dead. It is a kind of keeping." Cassian had stared at her, and then, gravely, shown her the wooden bird. "The first thing, Mrs." Alcott confided later in a scandalized whisper, the young lord had shown anyone but the new duchess in a year and more. On the second evening, the dowager sent for the new duchess. Eloan went expecting the same cool inspection she had met everywhere in that house. She found instead a small, fierce woman in black lace who looked at her for a long, unhurried moment across the firelight, and then said without any preamble at all, "Sit down, child, and stop arranging your face. I have watched people arrange their faces for 70 years, and yours is very good, which is precisely why it interests me." Eloan sat. "You are not what my grandson Stuart whispers you are," the dowager went on, pouring the tea herself with no ceremony. "A grasping little schemer does not coax a mute child's grief into speech, and then ask nothing for the trick. Her sort cash their kindnesses like promissory notes. You bank yours, and let them go. It is either the deepest cunning I have met, or none at all, and I have not decided which. The first time a person has puzzled me in years." She set down the pot. "And you are not what you pretend to be either. A merchant's soft ward whose eyes swim at a column of figures. I watched you glance at the household accounts when Rennick left the book open. You read them the way a hawk reads a hedgerow. So, we may set aside 2 of your masks between us, and save the time neither of us can spare." For once, Eloan could think of nothing safe to say. The old woman's gaze was not unkind. It was merely impossible to hide from, and Eloan had spent 4 years hiding. "I will not ask your secrets," Morwenna said more gently, as though she had heard the thought. "A woman keeps her secrets for reasons, and I have kept a great many of my own that would curl your hair. But I will tell you something, and you will hear it, because I believe you are the only soul in this house with the wit and the will to make use of it." She leaned forward, and the softness went out of her voice like warmth out of a room. "My grandson believes he has kept himself safe by turning a key on every door in this house, and in his own heart. He is wrong. A locked door keeps the griefs shut in quite as well as it keeps the loves shut out. Any jailer can turn a key, child. It takes love to give one away. And Merrick has forgotten how, if the poor cold creature ever knew." The words settled into Eloan like a stone let fall into still water, sending rings out to the edges of everything. Then the dowager said the thing that turned the whole evening cold. There was another woman in this house who read those ledgers as you read them. She was watching Eloan with great care now, and had lowered her voice though the door was shut. "My grandson's wife, Isolde. She was clever. Cleverer than Emmerich, I always thought, though he would not have thanked me for saying so. In the last month of her life, she came to me frightened, not of dying. She did not yet know she was to die. She was frightened of Ambrose Rennick. She had found something in the accounts of this estate that she could not make lie flat. no matter how she turned it, and she meant to carry it to Emmerich, and to the law beyond him if the law was needed. The old mouth thinned to a white line. 3 weeks later she was in the ground. Brucked. A fever, they said. A fever that burned her up faster than any I have watched in 70 years of watching people die. And every paper she had gathered was gone from her rooms before the mourning cloth was even hung at the door. Gone, child. As if it had never been. Eloin's heart was beating very hard against her stays. Why are you telling me this? Because you are moving against him, said Morwenna simply. I do not know how, or toward what end, and I find I do not need to. I have watched that man draw the strings of this house tighter for a year with a smile on his face, and been able to do nothing, for a widow with suspicions, and no proof is only a mad old woman that men humor and ignore. But I have watched, and I know the look of someone else who was watching him back. She reached across and took Eloin's hand, and her grip was startlingly strong, the bones of it like a bird's and twice as fierce. He has begun to make inquiries about you. He wrote to London this very week. I saw the letter go with my own eyes and marked the direction. Whatever you came to Windhollow to do, do it quickly, and take the very greatest care in the doing. He destroyed one woman in this house who came too near his ledgers. The black eyes held hers without a tremor. See to it, my girl, that you are not the second. Eloin had meant to be patient. Morwenna's warning burned the patience clean out of her. She lay awake that night doing sums of a different kind. If Rennick's letters ran their course to London and back, he would learn the name Caro, and then he would know that the woman sleeping under his master's roof was the one loose thread left over from the first murder he had done with a pen, and a man who had already buried one inconvenient duchess in a hurry would not lie long awake over a second. And if she did nothing and waited, the debt would fall due at midwinter, and Rennick would move to take the house by law, and the first thing he would do with the freedom of it would be to walk up to the sealed room at the top of the north stair and feed every dangerous paper in it to a fire. Whatever remained of Isolde's proof, whatever the dead woman had gathered and hidden before her clever mouth was stopped, had to come out of that room now while Eloin still wore a face he had not yet learned to read. For 3 days she waited on the weather, and on the 4th night the moor gave her what she needed. The storm came down off the high ground after dark, a great howling weight of wind and driven snow that flung itself against the old glass until the panes shuddered in their leads and the candles guttered in rooms with every door shut. The servants went early and gladly to their beds. The Duke, she knew from weeks of learning his habits the way a sailor learns a coast, would sit out such a night in the far study at the other end of the house, alone with his ledgers and the particular grief that storms seemed to stir in him. By 1 in the morning, Windhollow was as close to sleeping as that watchful house ever came, and the gale covered every sound a careful woman might make. Eloin rose, fully dressed, a dark shawl bound close over her shoulders, and took from beneath the loose board under her washstand the thing she had made in secret over 3 patient weeks. It was a key, filed by hand night after night from a soft iron blank, cut to the wax impression she had lifted in a single held breath from the fat ring Rennick had left forgotten on the parlor table one careless afternoon in her first fortnight. She had shaped it by feel and by memory, and by her father's long-ago lessons on the anatomy of locks, and she had no way on earth of knowing whether it would turn until she stood before the wards and tried it. If it failed, she was only a foolish wife who could not sleep. If it turned, she was a housebreaker, and passed every safe road back. She did not light her candle until she had felt her way down the servants' stair and stood at the very foot of the north tower, where no window could betray a flame. The door there was locked, as it was always locked. She fitted her filed key to it, and turned, gently, gently, and felt the wards bite, and catch, and hold. Her heart dropped. She drew the key a hair's breadth back, and eased it, and tried again with the lightest pressure she could bear to use, coaxing rather than forcing. And with a small dry click, that seemed loud as a pistol in the stairwell, the lock gave and the door swung inward on darkness and cold. The stair rose before her, narrow and turning, the treads worn hollow at their centers by 200 years of feet. "The stone is loose above the second landing," Rennick had told her. "All soft concern, for your own protection." She climbed on the outer edges of the steps where the wood was soundest, one gloved hand flat against the freezing curve of the wall. Her candle held low and shielded. At the second landing the warning proved true. The tread beneath her foot shifted and ground and tilted, and for one endless instant she hung there, with her weight going wrong and the black drop of the stairwell yawning at her shoulder, and then she flung herself forward onto the landing proper and lay a moment with her cheek to the cold stone and her pulse roaring in her ears, and understood quite calmly that the loose step had never been about her safety at all. It was a snare, set and waiting. She rose and stepped over it and went on up. At the top was the muniment room. Her key turned in that lock too, more easily than the first, as though the door had been used more often than a sealed room ought to be. It opened on a breath of dust and old leather and stone-cold air, and Elowen stepped into the buried heart of Halvain, a low, windowless chamber lined from floor to vaulted ceiling with deed boxes and ledgers and bundled papers, the whole accumulated memory of 300 years of a great family, all of it sleeping under a soft gray pelt of dust. Her candle threw enormous shadows that leaned and swung as she moved. Somewhere far below, the storm shrieked against the tower like something trying to get in. She began to work. She was methodical because she had been raised by a methodical man, and because panic was a luxury she could not afford. Box by box, drawer by drawer, shelf by shelf, she searched, reading, discarding, reading, her fingers going numb, her eyes streaming from the dust, her ears straining under the noise of the storm, for any sound that was not the storm. Twice she froze, certain she had heard a footstep on the stair, and stood with her candle pinched dark between finger and thumb and her back to the shelves, until her heart slowed enough to hear that it was nothing. There was so much of it. Rent rolls a century old, marriage settlements of women 100 years dead. The clean official record of a family that had had nothing to hide laid over the one thing that someone most certainly did. Her candle had burned down by a third when the tower gave her its worst moment. Somewhere below on the stair came a long groaning creak, the very note the loose tread had made under her own foot, and Elowen went rigid. The blood turned to ice in her, certain past all reason that she had been followed up, that a soft-bearded shadow stood even now on the landing with a lamp of his own. She pinched the flame dead between finger and thumb and pressed herself into the black angle of the shelves and did not breathe. A second creak, a third slower, settling, and then nothing but the wind, worrying at the old stones as it had worried at them for 300 winters. The tower, shifting in the storm. Only that. She struck her light again with hands that would not quite hold steady and made herself go on, because the one thing worse than being caught would be to have come this far for nothing at all. She almost missed it. Behind a close-set row of estate ledgers on the highest shelf, wedged flat against the back wall, in the one place an idle searching hand would never think to reach, was a slim packet wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a woman's hair ribbon, faded now, but once, she thought, a soft spring green. Elowen's numb fingers fumbled at the knot for what felt like an hour. When the oilcloth fell open, the topmost paper was covered in a fine, quick, slanting hand she had never in her life seen, and knew at once past any possibility of doubt whose it must be. If this is found, it began, and I am not here to speak for it. Then read it. And God keep you braver than I have been. I sold. The late Duchess had come this far before her. She had gathered everything, sheets of the old Duke's genuine signature, patiently cut from letters and receipts and franked covers, a faithful copy of the text of the great bond that Rennick swore the old Duke had signed on his deathbed, and in her own hand, close written and unflinching. A memorandum comparing the two signatures loop by loop and stroke by stroke, laying out, with a clarity. Eloin's own scholar, father could not have bettered the exact and damning proof that the hand upon the bond was not the hand of the man whose name it wore. And at the very bottom, dated 11 days before she died, I have hidden this where he does not think to look, for I no longer trust the locks he keeps. Tomorrow I take it to my husband, whatever he chooses to believe, of his wife. She had never reached her tomorrow. Eloin knelt in the dust with the dead woman's proof in her shaking hands, and understood, fully and finally, and with a cold that had nothing to do with the room, precisely what manner of man slept 2 floors below with his faultless ledgers, and precisely what he had done, or arranged, to keep this small ribbon-tied packet from ever seeing the light of a single morning. She was so deep in it that she did not hear the door. She heard the voice. "Step away from the shelf," said the Duke of Halvain out of the black behind her, "and turn slowly, so that I may see for myself what my wife has climbed a locked stair in the dark to steal. Let us pause here just for a breath. If this story has taken hold of you, subscribe, and the next one will find its way to you." Now back to the dark at the top of the stair, Eloin turned. He stood filling the low doorway with a lamp raised in one hand, and its hard light fell across a face she had never seen him wear. Not the courteous mask, not the carved and frozen calm, but the raw thing beneath both of them, fury and dread braided together into something close to anguish. The look of a man who had climbed a stair already certain his heart would be broken at the top of it, and had come up only to learn the shape of the blow. "There are perhaps 3 people in this world I have not schooled myself to distrust," he said very low, and each word was steady and terrible. "It seems I was a fool even in so short a list. Whatever you are holding, madam, put it down." She did not put it down. She rose to her feet in the swinging shadow, and she held the packet, the dead woman's ribbon and all, against her chest with both hands, and she lifted her chin, and she met the Duke of Halvain's eyes across his father's ruined secret. "No, Your Grace," she said, and her voice did not shake. "I don't believe I will." For a long moment there was no sound but the storm flinging itself at the tower and the small hiss of the lamp. He came into the room. He was a great deal larger than she was and very angry, and she held her ground beneath the weight of it, the way she had held it under every cruelty of the last 4 years, because the truth, spoken level and without a tremor, carries an authority that pleading never can. And a frightened woman who does not flinch is the one thing a certain kind of powerful man does not know how to answer. "You married me for the settlement," Emeric said. "You gave me your quiet obedience and your empty, pleasant face, and all the while you were counting the locks in my house. You crept into my dead father's papers in the black of night, like a thief. Give me one reason. One, why I should not go down and wake the household and send a man for the magistrate before you can draw another breath. Because if you send for the magistrate tonight," Eloin said, "you will put irons on the wrong criminal, and by the first thaw the right one will hold your house, your name, poor, and your son." That stopped him where he stood. She held the packet out, not thrust, not flourished, only offered across the small cold space between them on both her open hands. "I did not come to Windhollow to take anything from you, Your Grace. I came to give something back to you, and I have spent these weeks and every ounce of nerve I possess trying to reach it. Read your wife's hand. Read what Isolde died with in her mouth. And then, when you have read it, you may decide what is to be done with me, and I will not say a word against whatever you choose." She watched the anger falter as his eye fell on the writing, watched him go still, and then very white about the mouth, watched the lamp shiver because the hand that held it was no longer steady. He set it down because he had to, and read the first lines of Isolde's memorandum standing, and then groped for his father's chair, and sat as though the strings of his knees had been cut, and read the whole of it through, and then again more slowly, his lips moving once or twice as if to be certain the dead had truly written it. He said at last, it was not a question, but she answered it as though it were. She found what I found, what anyone raised to it would find, if only they were led up these stairs to look. The bond crushing this estate is a forgery, made whole from nothing. Your father never set his name to it. The debt is an invention, drawn up in a fine, steady hand by the one man who stands to inherit the wreck when Halvane falls, the same man who has worn the second key to this room on his belt for a year and told your wife it was lost, or the hour unsuitable every time she asked to come up. She crossed the little room and knelt at the arm of the chair, so that he could not look anywhere but at her. I can prove every stroke of it. I was raised to read a false instrument, the way you were raised to sit a horse. It is the whole of the inheritance my father was able to leave me, and this night it is worth more than gold. That is who I am, your grace. Not a merchant's soft ward with swimming eyes. Something a very great deal more dangerous to Ambrose Rennick than he has ever once suspected. He stared down at her, and slowly the fury drained out of his face and left behind it something she had not braced herself for at all. Not gratitude, not even wonder, but a grief so old and so total that it seemed to hollow the man out where he sat. She came to me, he said, his voice gone strange and flat, in the last weeks. She stood in front of me with papers in her hands and asked me only to look, and I told her she was overwrought, that she must rest, that the child was making shadows of her nerves. I told her to leave the business to Rennick, as I left everything to Rennick, because I was tired and grieving my father, and it was easier. The last word broke in his mouth, and 3 weeks later I stood at her grave, and never once asked why so strong a fever took her so fast, nor where her frightened papers had gone. I told myself, grief makes shadows out of honest dust. He looked at the dead, beloved handwriting. I did not fail to save my wife, madam. I refused to hear her. There is no forgiveness in that. Alowan did the only thing she could think to do. She put her hand, chapped and ink-stained, roughened by the cold of that house, and by weeks of secret work no duchess was ever meant to do, over his where it lay clenched on the arm of the chair, and left it there, and did not take it away. Then hear me now, she said. You could not hear her. Hear me. He turned his hand under hers and gripped it hard, blind, the way a drowning man grips the single rope thrown across the water to him, and for a long time the Duke of Halvane, who had set his name to a written promise that there would be no tenderness between them now or ever, held fast to his wife's hand in the dark of his dead father's room, and did not let it go, and was not ashamed that she could feel him shaking. When at last he spoke again, his voice had steadied into something new, something with iron come back into it, but iron of a different temper than before. Who are you? And Alowan, who had guarded that one answer with her very life for 4 long years, felt it rise all the way to her lips and stopped it there, on the edge of the world, because to give him her name, now, with his gratitude raw and every wall in him thrown down, would be to bind him by pity and by debt. She had knelt at her father's frozen grave and sworn she would never again take one thing from any man by those roads, not if she starved for the refusing of it. Whatever came of this night, it would not be a great lord's guilt mistaking itself for something warmer. Someone who came to set you free, she said. Let that be enough of an answer, your grace, just for tonight. She did not know, how could she have known, that 2 floors below them, sleepless behind his own shut door, Ambrose Rennick had that very evening received a certain letter carried up from London through the leading edge of the storm, and was sitting at his desk in the light of a single patient lamp, reading over and over the maiden name of the Duchess of Halvane. They had 3 weeks until midwinter and a war to wage in perfect silence. Emmerich changed overnight, and the whole household felt the change without understanding one word of it. The master who, for a year, had signed whatever was set before him and asked no questions, began quietly and courteously, to want things explained. He called up ledgers. Rennick had not shown him since his father's funeral. He rode out through the snow to tenants he had left the steward to manage, and sat at their kitchen fires, and asked in his grave way how their rents were reckoned, and to whom precisely they were paid, and came home each evening with his mouth set harder than he had left it. He did all of this with a care that would not startle his quarry, for they had agreed, he and Eloin, in long, low voices by the nursery fire, while the boy slept in the settle between them, that Rennick must never guess the ground had shifted beneath him until the moment they could pull the whole of it away at once. Those hours by the nursery fire became, without either of them naming it, the truest of the day. They spoke of forgeries and figures and the law of exemplars and the long, patient anatomy of fraud, and underneath the strategy, in the warmth of a banked fire in a sleeping house, something else grew that neither had bargained for and neither dared name. He learned that she took her tea unsweetened and read 3 languages and could not for her life carry a tune. She learned that beneath the granite the Duke of Halvain had a dry, buried, startling humor, and that he watched his sleeping son with a hunger that frightened him. Once their hands met over the same paper, and neither drew back for a full, slow breath, and then both did, and neither looked at the other, and the fire cracked in the grate, and the clause in the contract sat between them on the hearth like a third person in the room. For Isolde's packet, though it broke Emmerich's heart, would not by itself break a forger. Eloin made him understand this, gently, on the second night. What they held was proof of a forgery. It was not yet proof against the forger. A man as careful as Rennick would simply deny that the hand was his, would produce his beautiful counterfeit bond with the old Duke's counterfeit signature, and dare any court in England to prove otherwise, exactly as 3 courts had once failed to prove it against a mild country solicitor named Carow. To break such a man past all his wriggling, they needed the one thing a forger can neither destroy nor bear to part with, his exemplars, the practice sheets. The patient, secret, incriminating rows of a dead man's signature copied and copied and copied over, 100 times 1,000, until it flowed as freely from the thief's pen. Every forger keeps them, Eloin said, and her voice was her father's voice for a moment. From a happier world, he tells himself he keeps them for safety, to match his older work. In truth, he keeps them because he cannot help it. A forger loves his own false hand far too well to feed it to the fire. So, the Duke of Halvain sent, under his private seal, and by a rider he trusted with his life, for 2 men. The first was a king's officer, a magistrate of the Northern Circuit, whose reputation for scrupulousness was matched only by his reputation for having refused, across 30 years on the bench, every bribe, every threat, and every dinner invitation that might one day be called in. He owed the House of Halvain precisely nothing, and could not be bought at any price, which was exactly why Emmerich wanted him. The second was an old man. He was an examiner of questioned documents from the far north country, near Blaenau, retired these many years, who had once been reckoned the finest reader of a false hand in all of England. When Eloin wrote his name upon the paper, Emmerich saw her fingers tremble around the pen. "He gave evidence for my father," she said before he could ask. "At the trial." He was the one man in that whole courtroom who looked at the bonds and saw the truth and stood up and said it aloud, that the hand was forged, that an innocent man was being broken before their eyes. They overruled him. They said his eyes were failing and his day was past, and they let the guilty walk out free into the sunshine. And they broke my father across their knee for the crime of having been robbed. She folded the letter with great care. He wrote to me once after. He said he had not slept a whole night since. He will come north through any storm you like, Your Grace. He has been waiting 9 years for the chance to finish the sentence that courtroom would not let him speak. But Rennick, who had been playing this long game his whole life, moved first. He had the London letter now, and its answer, and he was far too clever a creature to strike at a duchess with his own bare hand. Instead, 3 days before midwinter he came to Emmerich wearing the softest and most sorrowful of all his many faces, and laid upon the great desk a neat little dossier of his own devising. Proofs, he murmured, that the woman his grace had so trustingly married was an impostor and worse. A Lowen Caro, daughter of one Elias Caro, a solicitor, struck from the rolls in disgrace for the very crime of forgery, a fallen, penniless, desperate creature who had wormed her way into Halvain under a false name and a false history, doubtless in league with Confederates, doubtless to strip the house from the inside. The marriage, Rennick pointed out with every appearance of grief, could be quietly annulled on the discovery. The creature could be handed to the law. "I blame only myself, your grace," he said, and pressed a hand to his heart. "It was I who brought her among us. Let it be I who removes her, swiftly and silently, before the smallest breath of the scandal can ever touch your name. It was a masterstroke, and 1 month earlier it would have worked flawlessly." Rennick had taken the single truest thing about Alowen, her name, her father, her ruin, and dressed it in the borrowed clothes of guilt, precisely as he had dressed her father's honesty in the clothes of theft 9 years before. He fully expected the Duke to recoil from his bride in cold aristocratic horror and hand her over gratefully to be disposed of. The Duke looked at the dossier for a long, long time. "Her father," he said at last without looking up, "was struck from the rolls upon forged evidence. Was he not, Mr. Rennick?" It was not a question. He raised his eyes, and they were no longer the tired eyes of a man who signed whatever was set before him. "You would know that better than any man living. It was your own hand that forged it." The steward's face did not change. Not quite, but something behind it went very still, the way a pond goes still when the thing beneath the surface stops moving. "Grief has made your grace fanciful," Rennick said softly. "Very likely." Emmerich rose to his full height behind the desk. "We shall put it to the proof at midwinter, when the debt of this house falls due. And I settle every last account of Halvain before witnesses. All of them, Mr. Rennick, root and branch in the open, in the great hall. You will attend, of course. You have settled every account of this house for 20 years. It would be strange indeed if you were absent for the reckoning." He let the silence draw itself out until it was very thin. "Bring your ledgers. Bring all of them, mind. We would not wish the record to be incomplete." Ambrose Rennick bowed himself out of the room with his composure entirely intact, and it was that intactness, Eloin thought when Emmerich told her of it, that frightened her most of all. For a guilty man who does not sweat is a guilty man who believes he still holds a card unseen. That night, from the dark of the nursery window, she watched the proof of it. A single lamp burned very late in the wing that held the steward's rooms. And near 2 in the morning, while the house slept, she saw a manservant she did not know cross the snow-covered stable-yard, bent under the weight of a small, heavy, iron-bound trunk, and loaded into the corner of an outhouse under a heap of sacking, and she understood that Rennick had heard the first jaw of the trap swing shut and was making ready, wand in his patient and bloodless way, either to run with his poison or to burn it before the reckoning could come. They set the king's men to watch that outhouse, day and night, without a word, and in the meantime the days ran down toward midwinter, and Alowen did the thing that cost her more than the climb up the north stair had cost her, more than the confrontation in the dark, more than anything the whole long masquerade had asked of her yet. She began, quietly, to pack, for it was very simple. When she laid it out plain before herself, in the cold arithmetic her father had taught her. Once the forgery was broken, the debt would be broken with it. Once the debt was broken, the settlement that had bought her would be revealed as a thing the estate had never needed, and could be handed back in full. And once that was done, there would remain no earthly reason under heaven for the marriage to stand. A marriage got up out of nothing but money, between a man who had sworn in ink never to love her, and a woman who had come only to set him free of the very trap she was about to spring. She would have her name again. She would have her father's honor and his little house in the south. She would have won everything she had crossed 3 counties and buried her whole self to win. She had never in her life felt so much like weeping. Emmerich found the first folded gown lying in her open trunk 2 days before the reckoning. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment, and he said nothing at all. But that evening, at the endless polished table where for all those weeks a footman had carried his cooled remarks the whole cold length of the oak, the Duke of Halvain rose from his place and drew out the chair at his wife's right hand and sat down in it, close enough to speak low and be heard by no one else in the world. "You mean to leave," he said. "When it is finished," Elowen answered, and kept her eyes upon her plate, because she had found to her dismay that she could look at the man and she could speak the words, but that she could not do both at once. "You will be free of the debt, and free of the bargain that the debt bought, and free of a wife you were never permitted to choose and never asked to love. That was the whole of what I came here to give you, your grace. From the very first hour, you need only let me set it in your hand and go." For a long moment Emmerich of Halvain was silent, and the candles burned, and the great hall held its breath around the 2 small figures at the foot of the enormous table. "We shall see," he said at last, "what I need." And there was nothing left in his voice, now, of any man reading aloud from a contract. Midwinter dawned gray and utterly still, the storm long blown out to sea, the moor lying white and silent and unbroken to the very edge of the world. By the Duke's command, the great hall of Windhollow was set out as a court of reckoning. A long table, chairs ranged along it, a fire built high against the cold that never left those stones. To it Emmerich summoned the whole living business of the house, the tenants owed and owing, the family's grey London lawyer, the household above the rank of scullion, and arrived on horseback through the small hours with a warrant folded in his coat, the grave king's magistrate of the Northern Circuit, who bought nothing and sold nothing, and had come a long way to watch a duke keep an honest account at last. In a closed carriage over the frozen roads came the second guest, a stooped ancient man with clouded eyes and a worn leather case of lenses on his knee, who had once been the finest reader of a false hand in England and had spent 9 years waiting to say so where it would be heard. The dowager sat at the head of the table in her black lace, upright as a blade, her old eyes as bright and hard and glad as a hunting bird's. But Cassian stood pressed against Elowen's skirts, silent and solemn, the little mended wooden bird gripped tight in one fist. And Ambrose Rennick came in last of all, calm and grey and faultless, and set his ledgers upon the table with the ease of a man who has balanced every column of his life and fears no accounting under God or the king. He was still calm when the Duke laid the ribbon-tied packet on the wood between them, the faded green of it catching the firelight. He was still calm when Elowen rose, no longer in the soft muslin of a bought bride, but in her own plain black, her own unmasked self at last, and in the clear, level voice her father had trained in her, walked the silent hall stroke by stroke through the anatomy of the lie, the old Duke's true signatures, the single false one upon the bond, the dead Duchess's own memorandum setting the two side by side, the whole patient architecture of the forgery that had been strangling Halvain and had strangled an honest solicitor's name to death 9 years before it ever reached this house. He stopped being calm when the old half-blind examiner asked in his cracked and courteous voice that a certain iron-bound trunk be brought in, for the king's men had lifted it that dawn from beneath the sacking, where Rennick's servant had hidden it, the very trunk the steward had meant to carry away. And now the old man opened it with fingers that knew paper the way a blind harper's knows strings, and drew out, one after another, the practice sheets, page upon yellowed page, of a dead duke's signature, copied and copied and copied over, the same false name marching down sheet after sheet in a living steward's unmistakable hand, until every soul at that table could see the truth that 3 bought or blind courts had once refused to see. "That is your hand, Rennick," said the old examiner, and laid a copied signature beside a page from the steward's own open ledger, and set them both where the magistrate could look. I read it 9 years ago in a courtroom that would not hear me, and I have read it in my sleep every night since, and I know it as I know my own. God be thanked, I have lived to say so twice." Ambrose Rennick rose from his chair very slowly, and looked once around the silent ring of faces turned toward him. The tenants, the lawyer, the magistrate, the old blind man, the bright fierce eyes of the dowager, the boy, the woman in black, and found not one door left open to him anywhere. "You forged a dead man's promise into a living man's chains," said the Duke of Halvain, and though he never raised his voice, it filled the cold hall to its rafters. "You ruined an honest man for being in your way, hounded him into an early grave. And when his daughter's name came to me, dressed in your hand as guilt, you asked my leave to call it justice. And my wife here, and only here, his voice came near to breaking, and he mastered it. Isolde came to you with the truth in her hands. Within 3 weeks, she was dead of a fever no physician who saw her could name, and every paper she had gathered was gone from her rooms before she was cold. The magistrate will be inquiring into that last matter, Mr. Rennick, very closely and for a very long time." And now, at the last, the steward's composure broke, not into remorse, for there was no seed of it anywhere in the man, but into the raw, spitting fury of one who has watched the patient work of a lifetime come to ruin in a single winter morning. "She is a Caro," he flung out. One shaking finger flung toward Elowen. "A forger's whelp, a liar who wormed her way into your house under a false name. No court in the land will take the word of." "Every court in the land," said the king's magistrate, rising unhurried to his feet, "will hear your word at the spring assize, sir. And hers, and this good gentleman's, all of it, and at its proper length." He inclined his head, and his officers came forward across the flagstones, and Ambrose Rennick was led out of the great hall of Windhollow, with cold iron on his wrists, and nothing left in any ledger of his that could save him now. No one cheered. Elowen had seen the inside of ruin, and could take no joy in another's, even his. Emeric only watched the man go, with a grave, quiet face, the face of one who had held the sweet, quick vengeance he might have taken, set it down, and chosen the law's slower, surer justice instead. Any jailer can turn a key, his grandmother had said. He had chosen in the end to open every door in the house instead, and then the great business was done. The debt of Halvain fell, not upon the estate, but upon the man who had forged it out of the air. The forgery was broken, the house was saved, which meant that Elowen was free to go. She made her farewells the next morning in the library, her single trunk already strapped in the hall, her father's honest name restored by order of the court, and his small house in the south waiting at last to receive its daughter. She had won every single thing she had spent 4 years of her one life to win. She had never felt more wretched. "I have had the settlement returned into your keeping," she told him, because it was easier to speak of money than of the other things. You never needed a penny of it. The debt was a lie from its first stroke. The annulment will be a simple matter. The false name alone will serve. So you are free, your grace, free of Rennick, free of the debt, free of the bargain it bought you. She made herself finish. And free of me. That was always the whole of what I came to give you. I hope you will let me give it, and not think you owe me anything for the taking." She turned to go. "No," said Emeric. She stopped, her hands not quite reaching the door. He came to her across the library, not with the cool distance of a stranger met on a road, but close, and then closer, until he stood directly before her, and she had to lift her face to meet his eyes. And he reached to the fine dark chain at his throat and drew out the old iron key, the key to the sealed room, the key he had worn against his own heart through every silent dinner of that long gray winter, and took her ink-stained, chapped, unladylike hand in both of his, folded her fingers around the cold iron, and closed his own hands over hers to keep them shut. My grandmother told me, he said, his voice low and unsteady and without a single mask upon it, that any jailer can turn a key, but that it takes love to give one away. I have been the jailer of this house, and of my own heart. For 14 months I locked every door in the place and locked you out with the rest, because I had promised myself I would never again love a thing the world could take from me. It seemed the only safe arithmetic left. His hands tightened around hers and the key within them. And then you walked into a cold and locked and grieving house, and one by one you set every prisoner in it free. My son, out of his silence. My wife's good name, out of the ground. My father's honor, this whole frozen ruin of a place, out from under the hand that was choking it. Every soul under this roof alone, every soul but one. You promised never to love me, she whispered. It was all she could find to say. I did. I set it down in ink under a black rule, so it should be quite unmistakable. It is the only promise I have ever made that I am glad to have broken. I struck no claim upon the heart out of that contract, the night you knelt at my father's chair and gave me back his soul, his honor, with your own 2 frightened hands, and I will not have it back on any terms you name. I have a claim upon your heart, and I am laying it before you now in the open, before God in the daylight, and asking you to let it stand. Eloan looked down at her hand, folded shut around the old iron key, folded shut inside both of his. You would have me stay, she said, as a debt repaid, as a kindness, as a thing you feel you owe. I would have you stay because I love you. Freely, for nothing, for the rest of my life, and for no reason but that I can no longer imagine an ordinary morning of it without your voice somewhere in the house, not as a bargain. Not as a curator of my library, or a mother to my son, or a coin, returned to its purse as my wife, and nothing less, because I love you. His gray eyes did not leave hers. You came here to set me free. Then do the whole of it, and set me free of the promise, too. It is the only chain in this house I am asking to keep. And Eloan Caro, who had come to Windhollow to unlock one single door in the dark, and had somehow, without ever intending it, unlocked every door in the place. Her own barred heart, the very last of them, closed her hand hard around the key, and around the hands that held it, and did not go. Then keep it, she said, and she stayed. By the following summer, Windhollow was not the same house, and everyone who came to it remarked upon the change without being able to say quite where it lay. The moor had turned from white to green and gold, the great windows stood open to the smell of gorse, and the rooms sealed against grief were sealed no longer, least of all the little door at the top of the north stair. It stood open all day now. Upon a bright book-lined study where the Duchess of Halvane kept the honest accounts of the estate in her own clear hand, and where, more often than not, a grave small boy sat at her elbow with a carved wooden bird, learning to make his own figures march down the page. For Cassian spoke now. Not a great deal, and not to everyone. He would always be his mother's grave, gray-eyed, watchful child, but he spoke in whole sentences, and once, on a bright June morning, laughed aloud at the gardener's dog, a sound that stopped every servant in the passage dead, for none had heard the young lord laugh before. Not long after the thaw he had asked his stepmother to mend the wooden bird's wing a second time, though it was perfectly sound. And Eloan, understanding exactly what was being offered, fetched her needle and mended a wing that did not need mending while the boy leaned his whole small warm weight against her side, and told her, in his careful way, about his mother. The old dowager stayed the whole of that summer and pronounced herself satisfied, which from Morwenna was as good as a hymn. Elias Caro's name was restored to the rolls by order of the court, 9 years late to the day, and read aloud in a chamber where his daughter sat dry-eyed until the very last syllable, and then wept as she had not let herself weep since she was 19. Ambrose Rennick answered at the spring assize for the forgery, and for a great deal else the magistrate's patient inquiry had by then begun to turn up concerning a certain unaccountable fever, and did not trouble the North Country again. And the Duke of Halvain, who had married a stranger to save his house and sworn he would never love her, was seen all that green summer walking the parkland at his wife's side, his son running on ahead, a man who had learned, late and at a bitter price, the difference between a door that is locked and one that is merely closed, and how much braver a thing it is to open one than to guard it. He had worn an iron key against his heart for a year, to keep the whole world safely out. In the end he gave it away to let one single person in, and that the Duke of Halvan came at last to believe was the only kind of freedom that had ever in all his life been worth the name.